In a quiet university town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, Dr. Evelyn Carter was known for her unconventional approach to science. She wasn't the kind of researcher who stuck to textbooks or followed traditional methods. Instead, she thrived on pushing boundaries, asking questions no one else dared to ask, and finding answers in places others wouldn't even think to look. Her latest idea, however, took things to an entirely new level. An idea so bold that it made even her closest colleagues raise their eyebrows. Evelyn had always been fascinated by death, not in a morbid way, but as a scientist seeking to understand its mysteries. For years, she studied forensic anthropology, focusing on how bodies decomposed under different conditions. But there was one question that kept nagging at her. What really happens inside a coffin after someone is buried? It wasn't just about decomposition. It was about understanding the environment itself, the changes in temperature, moisture, pressure, and everything else that occurred beneath the earth. No one had ever documented these processes up close and personal because, well, coffins were sealed shut once they were lowered into the ground. That's when Evelyn came up with her groundbreaking and somewhat unsettling plan. Her proposal was simple yet audacious. Place a camera inside a coffin before burial. This wasn't just any camera. It would be specially designed to withstand the harsh conditions underground, capturing high-definition footage for months without interruption. The goal was purely scientific, to observe and analyze what happened to a body and its surroundings after burial. Evelyn believed this could revolutionize fields like forensics, archaeology, and even environmental science. But convincing others to support her idea proved more challenging than she anticipated. When Evelyn first presented her concept at a faculty meeting, the room fell silent. Some of her colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged skeptical glances. One professor finally broke the silence, voicing what everyone seemed to be thinking. "Are you sure this is ethical?" he asked cautiously. "We're talking about placing technology inside a coffin, a space meant for rest and dignity." Evelyn nodded, acknowledging his concerns but quickly countered with her reasoning. "This isn't about disrespecting the deceased," she explained passionately. "It's about learning from them. These are individuals who have willingly donated their bodies to science. They understood that their contributions could lead to meaningful discoveries." Despite her persuasive arguments, not everyone was convinced. Ethicists raised questions about consent, privacy, and the potential psychological impact on families who might find out about the experiment later. Others worried about the public reaction if word got out. Would people see this as a violation of sacred rituals? Or worse, would it attract unwanted attention from conspiracy theorists and sensationalists? Evelyn knew these fears weren't unfounded, but she refused to give up. She spent countless hours revising her proposal, addressing every concern, and consulting legal experts to ensure the project adhered to all ethical guidelines. Finally, after months of debate and deliberation, Evelyn secured approval, but only under strict conditions. First, the experiment required explicit consent from the donors' families, which meant lengthy discussions and transparency about the purpose and scope of the study. Second, the camera would only record visual data related to the environment, ensuring no identifying features of the donor would be captured. And third, the results would remain confidential unless published in a peer-reviewed journal, safeguarding against misuse or exploitation. With the green light secured, Evelyn turned her focus to the technical aspects of the project. Designing the camera was no small feat. It needed to be durable enough to survive burial, compact enough to fit discreetly inside the coffin, and equipped with batteries capable of lasting several months. Collaborating with engineers, she developed a prototype encased in a rugged, waterproof shell. The lens was tiny, resembling a pinhole so it wouldn't draw attention or interfere with the solemnity of the burial process. To transmit data, the team installed a wireless system that could send recordings to a secure server above ground. As preparations continued, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. On one hand, she was thrilled to embark on such a unique and potentially transformative project. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the eerie undertones of what she was doing. Placing a camera inside a coffin felt like stepping into uncharted territory, not just scientifically, but emotionally. She often found herself wondering what it would be like to watch the footage. Would it reveal something extraordinary, or would it simply confirm what was already known? The day of the burial arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. A small group of researchers gathered at the designated site, a secluded corner of the university's research cemetery reserved for scientific studies. The coffin, draped in a plain white cloth, stood ready to be lowered into the ground. Inside lay the body of a volunteer donor, a man in his 70s, who had expressed a desire to contribute to medical knowledge even after death. His family had given their blessing, though Evelyn suspected they didn't fully grasp the specifics of the experiment. As the team worked methodically, double-checking every detail, Evelyn paused for a moment. Standing beside the open grave, she looked down at the coffin and felt a pang of unease. Was she crossing a line? Was this truly the right thing to do? Shaking off her doubts, she reminded herself of the importance of the work. Every great discovery came with risks, and this was no exception. Taking a deep breath, she signaled for the burial to proceed. The sound of dirt hitting the coffin echoed through the stillness of the forest. As the grave was filled and marked with a simple wooden cross, Evelyn felt a strange sense of finality. The camera was now buried, hidden beneath layers of soil, silently recording whatever lay ahead. Little did she know, the footage it would capture would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the mysteries that lie beyond. The days following the burial were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety for Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team. They had meticulously planned every detail of the experiment, but now that the coffin was underground, there was no turning back. The camera inside was their only connection to the hidden world beneath the soil, a silent observer recording events that no human eye could witness. For Evelyn, this waiting period was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Every morning she woke up wondering what the footage might reveal. Would it show something groundbreaking? Or would it simply confirm what they already suspected about decomposition and burial environments? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. The first batch of recordings arrived earlier than expected, thanks to the advanced wireless system they had installed in the camera. Sitting in her dimly lit lab, Evelyn leaned forward as the video began to play on her computer screen. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, or as ordinary as one could expect from footage taken inside a coffin. The screen displayed darkness, interrupted only by faint streaks of light seeping through tiny cracks in the wooden lid. The sound was muffled, dominated by the creaking of settling earth and the occasional drip of moisture. It wasn't thrilling or dramatic, but it was exactly what Evelyn had anticipated: a calm, quiet environment untouched by the chaos of the living world. For nearly 2 weeks, the footage remained consistent. The team reviewed it daily, noting subtle changes in temperature, humidity, and soil composition based on visual cues. They saw how the dampness clung to the inner walls of the coffin, creating a thin film of condensation. Insects occasionally scurried past the lens, likely drawn to the warmth radiating from the body inside. These observations were valuable, providing insights into the early stages of decomposition. But as the days passed, Evelyn began to feel a creeping sense of disappointment. Was this all the experiment would uncover? She had hoped for something more, something unexpected that would push the boundaries of scientific understanding. Yet, so far the results were disappointingly predictable. Then, on the 17th day, something unusual appeared on the footage. Evelyn was alone in the lab when it happened, scrolling through hours of uneventful recordings. Her eyes widened as she noticed a faint glow emanating from the edges of the coffin. At first she thought it might be a reflection or an optical illusion caused by the camera's lens. But as she rewound and replayed the clip multiple times, she realized it was real. The glow was soft and ethereal, almost like moonlight filtering through clouds, except there was no source of natural light underground. It pulsed gently, growing brighter and dimmer in irregular intervals. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her heart racing. What could possibly cause such a phenomenon? She immediately called Dr. Marcus Reed, her closest colleague and confidant, to share the discovery. Marcus arrived within minutes, his face etched with skepticism. "Are you sure this isn't some kind of glitch?" he asked, leaning over her shoulder to examine the footage. Evelyn shook her head. "I've checked everything," she replied firmly. "The camera is functioning perfectly. There's no technical error here." Together they analyzed the glowing patterns, trying to make sense of them. One theory suggested it might be bioluminescent bacteria thriving in the dark, oxygen-deprived environment. Another possibility was chemical reactions occurring between the decomposing body and the surrounding soil. Neither explanation fully satisfied Evelyn, though. Something about the glow felt unnatural. As if the mysterious light wasn't enough, strange movements began appearing in the footage shortly afterward. Shadows danced across the coffin walls, shifting and flickering without any apparent cause. At first, Evelyn convinced herself it was just dirt or insects moving near the lens, but the more she watched, the harder it became to dismiss these anomalies. The shadows didn't behave like typical objects. They moved too deliberately, almost as if guided by intent. Sometimes they lingered just outside the camera's narrow field of view, teasing the edge of perception. Other times they darted across the frame so quickly that Evelyn had to pause and rewind the video to catch them. The team grew increasingly uneasy as the strange occurrences continued. By day 25, the footage revealed another chilling detail: faint tapping sounds. These weren't random noises. They were rhythmic and deliberate, echoing softly against the wooden walls of the coffin. At first, the taps were sporadic, occurring once every few hours. But as time went on, they became more frequent, forming a pattern that seemed almost intentional. Evelyn spent hours listening to the audio, jotting down notes and searching for meaning. She even consulted linguists and codebreakers, hoping to decipher whether the taps corresponded to any known communication systems. One evening, while reviewing the recordings alone in her lab, Evelyn made a startling breakthrough. Using software designed to analyze Morse code, she fed the tapping sequences into the program. To her astonishment, the decoded message read, "Let me out." Her blood ran cold. The words repeated several times throughout the footage, always in the same eerie rhythm. Who, or what, was sending this message? And why? Evelyn stared at the screen, her mind racing with questions. Was this some kind of prank? A malfunction in the equipment? Or was it evidence of something far beyond? Scientific explanation? Determined to get answers, Evelyn shared the discovery with Marcus and the rest of the team. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright fear. Some argued that the message was a coincidence, a product of overactive imaginations interpreting random noise. Others suggested tampering. Perhaps someone had hacked into the system and planted the Morse code as a cruel joke. But Evelyn refused to accept either explanation. Everything about the experiment had been carefully controlled, leaving little room for external interference. Besides, the glowing light and shadowy figures added layers of complexity that defied logical reasoning. The tension among the team reached a breaking point. Several members voiced concerns about continuing the project, citing safety risks and ethical dilemmas. "We don't know what we're dealing with here," one researcher warned during a heated meeting. "If we keep going, we might unleash something we can't control." Evelyn listened to their arguments but remained steadfast. She understood their fears, but abandoning the experiment now felt like surrendering to ignorance. Whatever was happening inside that coffin deserved to be studied, not ignored or buried out of fear. To ease tensions, Evelyn proposed a compromise. Instead of relying solely on the camera's recordings, they would conduct additional tests above ground. Using specialized equipment, they scanned the area around the gravesite for signs of unusual activity. Ground-penetrating radar revealed strange voids in the soil, pockets of empty space that shouldn't exist naturally. Soil samples brought back to the lab showed elevated levels of microbial activity, far beyond what was typical for decomposition. These findings only deepened the mystery, fueling Evelyn's determination to dig deeper, literally and figuratively. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the lab grew heavier. Conversations became hushed, and glances between colleagues carried unspoken warnings. Evelyn found herself spending long nights alone, poring over the footage and data. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whatever was inside the coffin knew they were observing it. Sleep eluded her, replaced by vivid dreams of shadowy figures reaching out from the darkness. By the time the 30th day rolled around, Evelyn realized that the experiment had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a quest for knowledge had morphed into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. By the 30th day of the experiment, the mood among Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a scientific endeavor driven by curiosity and ambition now felt like a journey into uncharted territory, one that none of them were fully prepared for. The strange occurrences captured on the camera continued to escalate, pushing the boundaries of logic and reason. Every new piece of footage brought more questions than answers, leaving the researchers grappling with a growing sense of unease. The glowing light inside the coffin, which had first appeared on day 17, had grown brighter and more erratic. It no longer pulsed gently, but instead flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the wooden walls. These shadows moved in ways that defied explanation. Sometimes they stretched unnaturally long, as though responding to an invisible force. Other times they seemed to cluster together, forming vague shapes that resembled human figures. Evelyn spent hours analyzing these movements, trying to determine if they were caused by external factors like shifting soil or water seepage, but nothing in the data supported such explanations. The shadows behaved too deliberately, too purposefully, for it to be mere coincidence. Adding to the mystery were the tapping sounds, which had become louder and more frequent. The Morse code message, "Let me out," repeated itself endlessly, haunting the team with its urgency. Evelyn replayed the audio countless times, searching for variations or hidden meanings. Was it a cry for help, a warning, or something else entirely? She consulted experts in linguistics, cryptography, and even paranormal phenomena, hoping someone could shed light on the origin of the message, but no one could provide a satisfactory answer. Some suggested it might be a form of auditory pareidolia, a phenomenon where the brain interprets random sounds as meaningful patterns. But Evelyn dismissed this idea. The taps were too precise, too consistent to be chalked up to imagination. The situation reached a tipping point when the team noticed something truly unsettling. The shadows in the footage began interacting with the glowing light. On several occasions, dark silhouettes appeared to reach toward the source of the illumination, only to retreat quickly as if repelled by it. This interplay between light and shadow created a surreal, almost otherworldly effect. Evelyn couldn't help but feel as though she was witnessing some kind of struggle, a battle between opposing forces playing out in the confined space of the coffin. The thought sent shivers down her spine. As the days passed, the team's anxiety grew palpable. Conversations became strained, and tempers flared over minor disagreements. Several members openly questioned whether they should terminate the experiment immediately. "This isn't science anymore," one researcher argued during a tense meeting. "We're dealing with something we don't understand, and frankly, I'm not sure we want to." Others agreed, citing ethical concerns and fears about what might happen if the anomalies escalated further. Evelyn listened to their arguments but remained resolute. She believed that abandoning the project now would mean turning their backs on a potentially groundbreaking discovery. Still, she couldn't deny the weight of their concerns. Something about the footage felt wrong. It wasn't just strange. It was invasive, as though whatever was inside the coffin was aware of their presence and watching them through the lens of the camera. To ease tensions, Evelyn proposed conducting additional tests above ground. Using ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the area around the gravesite for signs of unusual activity. What they found shocked them. Beneath the surface, the soil showed large voids, empty spaces that shouldn't exist naturally. These cavities extended outward from the coffin in irregular patterns resembling tunnels or passageways. Soil samples collected from near the grave revealed elevated levels of microbial activity, far beyond what was typical for decomposition. Even stranger, the microbes exhibited behaviors unlike anything documented in scientific literature. They clustered together in dense formations and emitted faint luminescence when exposed to certain wavelengths of light. Could these organisms somehow be connected to the glowing light inside the coffin? Despite these findings, the team remained divided. Some members insisted that the anomalies could still be explained through natural processes, albeit rare ones. Others, however, were less optimistic. Marcus Reed, Evelyn's closest ally, voiced his fears during a private conversation late one night. "What if we've disturbed something ancient?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something buried deep underground that wasn't meant to be awakened?" Evelyn shook her head, unwilling to entertain such ideas. "That's superstition, Marcus," she replied firmly. "There has to be a rational explanation for all of this." But deep down, Evelyn wasn't so sure. Her dreams had become increasingly vivid, filled with images of shadowy figures reaching out from the darkness. She woke up each morning drenched, in sweat, her heart pounding as though she'd narrowly escaped danger. During the day, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching her. The feeling of being observed followed her everywhere, even outside the lab. Once, while walking home through the quiet university campus, she swore she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, there was no one there. The breaking point came on day 35, when the camera captured something that left the entire team speechless. In a segment of footage recorded late at night, the glowing light suddenly intensified, filling the coffin with an almost blinding radiance. Against this backdrop, shadowy figures emerged, not vague outlines, but distinct shapes that looked unmistakably human. They moved slowly, their forms wavering as if caught between states of existence. One figure paused directly in front of the camera, its features obscured but its presence undeniable. For a moment it seemed to stare straight into the lens before vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. Evelyn replayed the clip obsessively, her mind racing with possibilities. Were these apparitions residual energy left behind by the deceased donor? Manifestations of grief or trauma tied to the burial site? Or something entirely different? Something that defied conventional understanding? Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear. The experiment had crossed into uncharted territory. The line between science and the supernatural had blurred, leaving the team stranded in a gray area where logic faltered and instinct took over. Faced with mounting pressure from her colleagues, Evelyn made a difficult decision. She called an emergency meeting to discuss the future of the project. The room was tense, with everyone bracing for conflict. Some researchers demanded immediate termination, arguing that continuing the experiment posed unknown risks. Others, including Evelyn, advocated for cautious exploration, suggesting they dig up the coffin to investigate the anomalies firsthand. After hours of heated debate, a compromise was reached. They would exhume the coffin, but only after taking extensive precautions. Additional security measures were put in place, and a team of experts in forensic science, geology, and paranormal research was assembled to assist. As plans for the exhumation took shape, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping onto a precipice. The experiment had started as a quest for knowledge, but it had evolved into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Whatever awaited them beneath the soil, one thing was certain: it would change their lives forever. The decision to exhume the coffin was not made lightly. Dr. Evelyn Carter knew that digging it up could either provide answers or escalate the situation in ways they couldn't predict. The team spent days preparing for the operation, ensuring every detail was meticulously planned. They brought in additional equipment, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging devices, and even electromagnetic field detectors to monitor any unusual activity during the excavation. Security personnel were stationed around the site, though. Their presence felt more symbolic than practical. No one truly knew what they might encounter, and the uncertainty hung over everyone like a storm cloud. On the morning of the exhumation, the air was thick with tension. The secluded corner of the research cemetery where the coffin lay buried was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Evelyn stood at the edge of the grave, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched the team prepare. Marcus Reed stood beside her, his face pale and drawn. Neither of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate in the face of what they were about to do. The rest of the team worked quietly, their movements deliberate and cautious, as if afraid of disturbing something unseen. As the first shovelfuls of dirt were removed, Evelyn's mind raced with conflicting emotions. Part of her hoped that opening the coffin would reveal a simple explanation, a malfunctioning camera, geological anomalies, or some overlooked natural process. But another part of her, deep down, feared that they were on the verge of uncovering something far beyond their comprehension. She glanced at the monitors set up nearby, which displayed live readings from the sensors planted around the site. So far, everything appeared normal, but she knew better than to trust appearances. The digging progressed slowly, each layer of soil carefully examined before being moved aside. About halfway through the process, one of the researchers paused, frowning at the ground. "There's something here," he said, his voice low. He pointed to an irregular patch of soil that seemed denser than the surrounding earth. Using trowels and brushes, the team delicately uncovered what turned out to be a network of small tunnels radiating outward from the coffin's location. These weren't animal burrows, they were too uniform, almost geometric in shape, as though carved by intelligent hands. Evelyn crouched down to examine them more closely, running her fingers along the smooth walls. Her stomach churned with unease. What could have created these? And why? By late afternoon, the coffin finally came into view. It was partially covered in damp soil, its wooden surface darkened and warped from weeks underground. As the last bits of earth were cleared away, Evelyn noticed something peculiar. The lid of the coffin was slightly ajar. At first, she thought, it might be damage caused by settling earth or moisture swelling the wood. But upon closer inspection, she realized that wasn't the case. The gap between the lid and the base was too wide, and it looked as though it had been pushed open from the inside. A hush fell over the group as they stared at the coffin. No one spoke. The implications were too unsettling to voice aloud. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Do we open it?" he asked hesitantly. Evelyn nodded, though her heart was pounding. "We need to see what's inside," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. With great care, two members of the team pried the lid fully open, revealing the interior. What they found left them speechless. The camera, encased in its rugged shell, lay shattered on the floor of the coffin. Its lens was cracked, and wires protruded from the damaged casing like exposed nerves. The screen, still faintly lit, flickered erratically, displaying distorted images of shadowy figures reaching toward the lens. But that wasn't all. Around the camera, the lining of the coffin was torn and scorched, as if subjected to intense heat. The body of the donor, once carefully placed inside, was now unrecognizable, reduced to skeletal remains covered in a fine layer of ash-like residue. It didn't look like typical decomposition. Something else had happened here, something violent and inexplicable. Evelyn knelt beside the coffin, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out cautiously to touch the camera, only to pull her hand back when a sharp jolt of static electricity coursed through her fingertips. Startled, she looked around at the others, who were equally shaken. "This isn't possible," Marcus muttered, shaking his head. "None of this makes sense." But Evelyn couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. Her gaze drifted to the final frames captured by the camera before it failed. On the flickering screen, the shadowy figures loomed larger than ever, their forms twisted and grotesque. One of them appeared to be holding something, a glowing orb that pulsed with the same light they'd seen in earlier footage. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the image cut to black. The team worked quickly to document the findings, taking photographs, collecting samples, and sealing the coffin again for transport back to the lab. But as they packed up their equipment, an unsettling realization settled over them. Whatever had caused these changes hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt closer now, as though it had followed them above ground. Back at the lab, Evelyn and Marcus reviewed the data in painstaking detail. The soil samples contained traces of unknown minerals and compounds that defied classification. The microbial activity observed earlier had increased exponentially, forming dense clusters that emitted a faint luminescence under ultraviolet light. Even stranger, the electromagnetic field readings taken at the grave site showed spikes of energy concentrated directly above the coffin's location. None of this aligned with known scientific principles. As the hours stretched into the early hours of the morning, Evelyn found herself staring at the damaged camera. Despite its ruined state, it still held fragments of footage that hadn't yet been analyzed. Against her better judgment, she connected the device to her computer, hoping to recover any remaining data. To her surprise, the system managed to extract a few seconds of corrupted video. The playback was choppy and distorted, but one frame stood out clearly. A human face, pale and gaunt, staring directly into the lens. Its lips moved soundlessly as if trying to speak. Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice. The face didn't belong to the donor. It wasn't anyone she recognized. Yet it felt familiar, as though she'd seen it before in her dreams. Shaking off the eerie sensation, she called Marcus over to take a look. His reaction mirrored hers. Wide-eyed shock followed by a grim silence. "Who or what is this?" He whispered, more to himself than to Evelyn. Neither of them had an answer. But one thing was certain. The experiment had opened a door to something they couldn't close. The questions outweighed the answers, and the line between science and the supernatural had blurred beyond recognition. As exhaustion began to overtake her, Evelyn realized that the journey was far from over. Whatever force they had awakened in the coffin was still active, and it wasn't done with them yet. The days following the exhumation were a blur of sleepless nights, frantic discussions and mounting dread for Dr. Evelyn Carter and her team. The discovery inside the coffin had shaken them to their core, leaving them grappling with questions that defied logic and reason. Every new piece of data they analyzed only deepened the mystery, pushing them further into uncharted territory. What had started as a scientific experiment had spiraled into something far more complex and dangerous. Evelyn found herself unable to focus on anything else. Her mind was consumed by the image of the pale, gaunt face captured in the final frames of the damaged camera footage. It haunted her waking hours and invaded her dreams, its silent lips moving as if trying to convey a message she couldn't decipher. She replayed the clip repeatedly, hoping to find some clue hidden within the distortion. But no matter how many times she watched it, the face remained an enigma, a ghostly presence that refused to be ignored. Meanwhile, the lab buzzed with activity as researchers pored over the samples collected from the gravesite. The soil contained minerals and compounds unlike anything documented in scientific literature. Some of these substances reacted unpredictably when exposed to light or heat, emitting bursts of energy that caused equipment malfunctions. One researcher described the behavior as alive, though not in the biological sense. It was as if the materials carried traces of an intelligence, an awareness that responded to external stimuli. This theory sent chills through the team, especially since similar anomalies had been detected in the microbial clusters extracted from the coffin lining. The electromagnetic field readings added another layer of complexity. Spikes of energy continued to emanate from the area around the gravesite, even after the coffin had been removed. These fluctuations didn't follow any known patterns. They were erratic, almost chaotic, yet somehow intentional. When plotted on a graph, the data formed shapes that resembled symbols or glyphs, though their meaning eluded interpretation. Evelyn consulted experts in cryptography, linguistics, and ancient languages, hoping someone could shed light on the significance of these patterns, but none of them could provide answers. The symbols bore no resemblance to any known writing systems, past or present. As the investigation dragged on, tensions among the team reached a breaking point. Arguments erupted frequently, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and diverging opinions about how to proceed. Some members insisted on publishing their findings immediately, believing transparency was the best course of action. Others argued vehemently against this, fearing public panic or ridicule. Evelyn found herself caught in the middle, torn between her duty as a scientist and her growing unease about the implications of their work. She knew that sharing the results too soon could jeopardize both the project and her career, but keeping them secret felt equally wrong. One evening, while reviewing the footage alone in her office, Evelyn noticed something she had missed before. In the background of the distorted video clip, faint outlines of additional figures appeared. Shadowy forms standing just outside the camera's limited field of view. They weren't clearly visible, but their presence was undeniable. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen, her pulse quickening. Were these the same shadowy figures that had been captured earlier? Or were they something or someone else entirely? Determined to get answers, she called Marcus Reed into her office. Together, they scrutinized the footage frame by frame, searching for clues. As they worked, a chilling realization dawned on them. The figures seemed to be moving in synchrony with the glowing orb held by the gaunt-faced entity. It was as though the light served as a focal point, drawing the shadows toward it like moths to a flame. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Whatever force they had awakened in the coffin, it appeared to be connected to the interplay between light and darkness. Their analysis was interrupted by a sudden commotion in the lab. One of the researchers burst into Evelyn's office, his face pale and his hands trembling. "You need to see this," he stammered, leading them back to the main workspace. On one of the monitors, the thermal imaging device displayed unusual activity near the storage room where the coffin had been temporarily housed. Heat signatures flickered erratically, forming shapes that resembled human figures. At first, Evelyn thought it might be a malfunction in the equipment, but when she checked the live feed from the security cameras, her blood ran cold. The grainy black and white footage showed shadowy figures moving slowly along the edges of the room, their forms indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. The team sprang into action, sealing off the area and setting up additional sensors to monitor the situation. For hours, they observed the strange phenomena unfold, documenting every detail with meticulous precision. The figures never crossed into direct view of the cameras, remaining just out of reach, as though aware of being watched. Yet their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if performing some unseen ceremony. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were communicating, not with words, but through actions and gestures that carried meaning beyond human understanding. By midnight, the activity subsided as suddenly as it had begun. The heat signatures vanished, and the security cameras showed nothing but an empty storage room. Exhausted and shaken, the team convened in the conference room to discuss what they had witnessed. Opinions varied widely, ranging from suggestions of mass hallucination to theories involving interdimensional entities. Evelyn listened quietly, absorbing everyone's input without offering her own thoughts. Deep down, she suspected the truth lay somewhere in between, something rooted in science yet transcending its boundaries. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the lab early, determined to find closure. She sifted through the accumulated data, searching for connections that might explain the events of the previous night. That's when she stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried within the corrupted files from the damaged camera was a fragment of audio, barely audible but unmistakable. It sounded like whispers, layered on top of each other in a cacophony of voices. Using software designed to isolate and amplify sound, she managed to extract a single phrase. "We are waiting." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Waiting. For what? And who or what were we? Evelyn played the clip for Marcus, who reacted with equal alarm. Neither of them could deny the implication. Whatever force they had awakened wasn't finished with them. It was watching, biding its time, preparing for something greater. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the lab grew increasingly oppressive. Conversations became hushed, and glances between colleagues carried unspoken warnings. Several members requested transfers to other projects, citing personal reasons or health concerns. Evelyn understood their fears but refused to abandon the research. She believed that shutting down now would mean surrendering to ignorance, and possibly unleashing consequences far worse than anyone imagined. To ease tensions, she implemented stricter safety protocols, including 24-hour surveillance of the lab and regular psychological evaluations for the team. But despite these measures, incidents continued to occur. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Shadows appeared in corners of rooms where there should have been none. And late at night, when the building was quiet, faint tapping sounds echoed through the halls, always rhythmic, always deliberate, always spelling out the same Morse code message. "Let me out." Evelyn began carrying a small notebook with her everywhere, jotting down observations and reflections in an effort to make sense of the chaos. She wrote about the glowing orb, the shadowy figures, the whispers, and the relentless tapping. Each entry brought her closer to a terrifying conclusion. The experiment had opened a door, a threshold between worlds that couldn't be closed. Whatever existed on the other side was reaching out, testing the limits of its newfound freedom. One night, unable to sleep, Evelyn returned to the lab to review the notes she had compiled. As she flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged. The symbols detected in the electromagnetic field readings, the movements of the shadowy figures, the whispered phrase, all of it pointed to a singular purpose. The force they had awakened wasn't malevolent, at least not in the traditional sense. It was curious, driven by a desire to connect, to communicate across the divide separating life from death, matter from spirit, known from unknown. But curiosity alone wasn't enough. To quell Evelyn's fear, she realized that the true danger lay not in the force itself, but in humanity's inability to comprehend it. If left unchecked, their ignorance could lead to catastrophic consequences. With this sobering thought weighing heavily on her mind, she made a decision. She would publish the findings, not as a sensational story meant to shock or terrify, but as a call to action. Scientists, philosophers, and thinkers from all disciplines needed to come together to study this phenomenon, to bridge the gap between the seen and the unseen. It was a risky move, one that could cost her reputation, or worse. But Evelyn knew it was the right thing to do. As she sat in the dimly lit lab, surrounded by fragments of evidence and unanswered questions, she felt a strange sense of peace. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them. Whatever awaited her on the other side of the threshold, she would meet it head-on, with courage, determination, and an unwaver. The decision to publish the findings was both a relief and a burden for Dr. Evelyn Carter. On one hand, she felt a sense of liberation, finally sharing the truth with the world instead of carrying its weight alone. On the other hand, she knew that releasing this information would invite scrutiny, skepticism, and possibly even danger. The scientific community thrived on logic and evidence, but what Evelyn and her team had uncovered defied conventional understanding. Would people believe them? Or would they dismiss the entire project as a hoax or the result of overactive imaginations? Evelyn spent weeks carefully crafting the report, ensuring every detail was presented clearly and objectively. She included photographs, graphs, and video clips from the coffin camera, as well as detailed descriptions of the anomalies observed during the exhumation and subsequent investigations. To avoid sensationalism, she avoided using words like supernatural or paranormal, opting instead for neutral language that focused on observable phenomena. Still, the content itself was undeniably unsettling. Glowing orbs, shadowy figures, rhythmic tapping sounds, and electromagnetic spikes weren't exactly standard fare in academic journals. When the paper was finally ready, Evelyn submitted it to several prestigious publications, knowing full well that rejection was likely. Most editors balked at the unconventional nature of the study, citing concerns about credibility and public reaction. But one journal, a niche publication specializing in fringe science, agreed to review the manuscript. After months of back-and-forth revisions and peer reviews, the article was published under a modest title, Unexplained Phenomena Associated with Post-Burial Environments, a Case Study. It didn't grab headlines right away, but within days, whispers began spreading through academic circles. At first, the response was mixed. Some researchers praised the thoroughness of the documentation, acknowledging that the anomalies warranted further investigation. Others dismissed the findings, outright accusing Evelyn and her team of fabricating data or misinterpreting natural processes. Social media amplified the debate, with conspiracy theorists latching onto the story and speculating wildly about government cover-ups, alien contact, or portals to alternate dimensions. News outlets picked up the buzz, running sensationalized headlines like "Scientists discover ghosts in coffins" and "Is death just the beginning?" Evelyn cringed at the exaggerations but took solace in the fact that her work was sparking conversations, even if they were often misguided ones. As the controversy grew, Evelyn found herself thrust into the spotlight. Requests for interviews poured in from journalists, podcast hosts, and television producers eager to capitalize on the intrigue. Reluctantly, she agreed to a few appearances, hoping to steer the narrative towards science rather than speculation. During one live TV interview, a skeptical host challenged her to explain the shadowy figures captured on camera. "Could these just be tricks of light? Or maybe your equipment malfunctioned?" he asked, his tone dripping with doubt. Evelyn remained calm, meeting his gaze steadily. "We considered those possibilities," she replied, "but after extensive testing and analysis we ruled out technical errors or external influences. What we observed doesn't align with any known natural phenomenon. That's why we're calling for more research, not because we have all the answers, but because we don't." Her measured response earned her respect from some quarters, but criticism continued to mount. Colleagues at the university distanced themselves from her, fearing guilt by association. Funding for her department dried up as donors pulled their support, wary of being linked to such controversial work. Evelyn understood their fears, but she refused to back down. If anything, the backlash only strengthened her resolve to push forward. Despite the challenges, the publication of her findings brought unexpected allies into Evelyn's orbit. Paranormal investigators, spiritualists, and philosophers reached out, offering theories and insights that aligned with her observations. One particularly intriguing correspondence came from an elderly woman who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena decades earlier while working as a mortician. She described hearing faint whispers emanating from closed caskets and seeing inexplicable lights flicker in funeral homes late at night. Though her accounts lacked scientific rigor, they resonated deeply with Evelyn, adding a human dimension to the cold data she had collected. Encouraged by these connections, Evelyn decided to organize a symposium dedicated to exploring the intersection of science and the unknown. She invited experts from diverse fields, physics, psychology, anthropology, theology, and even art, to share their perspectives on the mysteries surrounding death and burial environments. The event drew a surprisingly large crowd, including academics, curious laypeople, and even a few skeptics willing to keep an open mind. For 2 days, attendees engaged in lively discussions, challenging assumptions, and proposing bold new ideas. By the end of the symposium, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps humanity wasn't ready to fully understand what she had uncovered, but at least the conversation had begun. Yet, despite the progress, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching her. Strange. Occurrences continued to plague the lab and her personal life. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Shadows lingered in corners of rooms where there should have been none. And late at night, when the world was quiet, she swore she heard faint tapping sounds echoing through her apartment, always rhythmic, always deliberate, always spelling out the same Morse code message, "Let me out." One evening, while attending a lecture on unexplained phenomena at a nearby university, Evelyn experienced a moment that chilled her to the bone. As the speaker discussed cases of alleged hauntings, she scanned the audience idly, her thoughts drifting back to her own experiences. Then out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of a familiar figure sitting near the back of the room. Pale skin, gaunt features, hollow eyes. It was the face from the final frames of the coffin camera footage. Her breath hitched as their gazes locked. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react in any way. It simply stared at her, its expression unreadable. For a split second, Evelyn considered bolting from the auditorium. But before she could act, the lights dimmed as the speaker transitioned to a slide presentation. When the room brightened again moments later, the figure was gone. Heart pounding, Evelyn scanned the crowd frantically, but there was no sign of the mysterious individual. Had it been real? Or had her mind conjured the image, projecting her fears onto an innocent bystander? She couldn't be sure. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn returned to her office at the lab. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at the stack of notes and papers scattered across the surface. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the events of the past year. The glowing light, the shadowy figures, the whispers, the tapping sounds. Each piece of evidence pointed to a singular conclusion. The experiment had opened a door, a threshold between worlds, that couldn't be closed. Whatever existed on the other side was reaching out, testing the limits of its newfound freedom. But Evelyn realized something else, too. The force they had awakened wasn't malevolent, at least not in the traditional sense. It was curious, driven by a desire to connect, to communicate across the divide separating life from death, matter from spirit, known from unknown. And perhaps in some small way, it had succeeded. Through the experiment, Evelyn and her team had glimpsed a reality far beyond the confines of human perception. They had stepped into the unknown and returned forever changed. Still, the implications weighed heavily on her. Humanity wasn't ready for this knowledge. Not yet. The gap between what they understood and what they didn't was vast and bridging. It required more than just scientific inquiry. It demanded humility, patience, and an openness to possibilities that defied logic. Evelyn knew she couldn't do it alone, but she also knew she couldn't turn away. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting soft golden light through the lab windows, Evelyn made a silent promise to herself. She would continue the work, not out of ambition or curiosity, but out of responsibility. Whatever awaited her on the other side of the threshold, she would meet it head-on, with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. Because deep down, she knew that the journey was far from over.